Uh, yeah, if you don't want to be recorded, please ask your question in chat to read it for me, and I will ask the question to our guests. And yeah, and that's it from technical side. Now I will ask Professor Barbara Engelking to introduce our guests. Basia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And this is a great pleasure and privilege to have Havi Dreifuss today with us. Havi is my close friend from, I don't know, many, many years, more than 25. And it's really a great honor, Havi. You agreed to share with us your presentation about your previous book. And Havi is professor of at the Tel Aviv University Department of Jewish History, and she also works as the head of the so-called Polish department at the International Institute for Holocaust Research, Yad Vashem. And her field of interest is everyday life of Jews during the Holocaust, Polish-Jewish relation, religious life during the Holocaust, and so on. She wrote several articles about these subjects, as well as 2 books. First was published in 2017, I think, by Yad Vashem, and was based on Havi's PhD, written in Hebrew 10 years later. And the last book is about the last month of the Warsaw Ghetto, and will be published in English very soon, and I hope will be published also in Polish. In this book about Polish and Jews during the Holocaust, which we are talking today about, Havi is writing about the relation between Poles and Jews, but which is not very common in Poland, from the Jewish point of view. And this is why the book is so interested for us and very, very important. The book is based on the great research. Havi found a lot of documents and testimonies in Polish, Hebrew, Yiddish, English, letters, unpublished documents, and everything is detailed, everything is used in this book. And which I like very much, especially is the poems, because Havi used also a lot of poetry, which is not very common in the scientific books. And it refers always to the emotions and feelings, and and to the atmosphere, and add a lot of information, not direct information, but mainly atmosphere in the ghetto. And what is important in this book is that this is the history of disappointment. And Havi writes about the hopes of Jews and their hopes and illusions concerning Poles. And from the beginning of the war, there was an expectation that Poles and Jews maintain some sort of solidarity in face on their common enemy. It means German, but unfortunately, this illusion and hopes didn't wait for very long time, and ended in disappointment. So, Havi, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, dear Basha, dear Professor Engelking, for having me here. Thank you, dear Agnieszka, and dear Yaakov, and dear Dagmara, for inviting me here. It really is wonderful to be with you, even if via Zoom. And there are so many friends in the audience that I won't mention any names, because for sure I will forget somebody and then will be mad of myself for a long time. So first of all, thank you for having me. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to present some aspects which I refer to in this book about Polish-Jewish relationship. And what I want to do is try to place it in this very wide historiography we have about Polish-Jewish relationship, explain why I even started researching it, and then give you a glimpse to some of the things I'm trying to claim in this book. So I'll share for a second presentation, 1 second. Okay, and as Professor Engelking-Basha, if I may already said, my book deals with Polish-Jewish relationship and referring to the Jewish perspective. And of course, it's not the only book which refers to Polish-Jewish relationship. This is such a heated and important subject that you all know that even Emanuel Ringelblum, while in hiding, referred to it and tried to write his very first research about it. Years later, there were different research written in Poland as well as in other places. I'll just mention that in Poland, some of those scholars who referred to the Polish-Jewish relationship during the Holocaust were people who were very much involved in assisting Jews during the war. Perkirova and Bartoszewski, both of them were very well-known writers among the nations. And outside of Poland, Jews also start writing about it in a different manner. They refer to assistance given to Jews during the war by Poles, but also to more darker aspects as well, and even try to examine specific structures within Poland under occupation. I'm referring to Engel's book about the Polish government exile, as well as a very important book written by Krakowski and Gutman years ago, Unequal Victim. In it, they try to say, well, it's true that Poland was under harsh occupation, but the Jewish victimhood was different and actually stemmed not only from Nazi Germany, but also from some involvement or some part of what was done by the Poles. I'm not trying to give here a very detailed historiography. I'll just mention the very well-known breaking points, which you, I'm sure, are very much aware of. Of course, Blonsky article at the end of the 80s, and later on Gross book with all the great discussion that it rose, not only in Polish and Jewish societies, but also in the academic world. And there were many other academic work written. Not all of them are so showing a balanced picture of those very complicated relationship, but all of them should be mentioned as well. I will say that the EPN back then was, of course, different than what we see today. And for example, in the book published, Polacy Żydzi, you can find some very good article with some which are more questionable. There was already then some kind of a concentration on Jews who assist Jews, but the very important vocal of Nego, and I saw that Persek is here with us, which tried to really expose the complication and the different aspects of what happened not only in Yad Vashem, but in other places, was of course an important contribution, as well as all those different research written by the center and its scholars. And I won't mention all of them. I'll say that other books are still being published on the issue, and maybe the most important late change is the one that again is very much connected to the center, and that is the book, the latest notes and the research connected to that, which brought us all, scholars in Poland and Israel and in other places, to understand some aspects that we were not aware of them before. So if so much it was written about this issue, why should anybody even discuss a Polish Jewish as a Jewish perspective, especially when Jews didn't have many abilities to change their future, or this is at least what we thought. So actually, this thesis, my book, started with a seminar I wrote in a course I took years ago, in a course given by Professor Otto Pulka. He passed away this January, and he was not only a Holocaust survivor who survived Auschwitz in the age of 10 years old, but also a great Holocaust researcher, dealt mainly with Nazi Germany, different aspects of opinion reports in public opinion reports in Nazi Germany. And in this course, I wrote this paper trying to see, it was really in my first degree, I didn't know so much about the Holocaust, of course, not from the academic point of view. And I was thinking of looking what Jews wrote in their diaries regarding different aspects of their life. And one thing that was very surprising for me as an Israeli is what I found in those diaries. In that time, I read only published diaries, what those Jews wrote about the Poles. Because being raised up in Israel and reading about the Holocaust, I was quite sure that I will find very negative impression and a very negative image of the Poles in Jewish writings from the very beginning. And it's not what I found. And this is what brought me later on to discuss this issue and try to understand the changing perspective of Jews during the war regarding their Polish surrounding. And here, let me start the real lecture. In April 1944, on the first anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, Julian Tuwim, the great Polish poet who at that time was in the United States, wrote a mass titled "We Polish Jews," My Żydzi Polscy. In it, Tuwim expressed his deepest bond to the Polish homeland, as well as his identification with the suffering of the Polish Jewry, a group he had previously tried to shun. Obviously, it is difficult, if not impossible, to study the attitude of Polish Jews expressed towards Poland under Nazi occupation from the writing of Tuwim, who even before the war had identified himself completely with the Polish culture. The time, the circumstances, as well as the people involved differ. But the question, what was the attitude of Polish Jewry towards Poland during the war, remains. Can we nowadays adequately assess the perception of Polish Jewry regarding their surrounding? Is the statement, "We Polish Jews," so far-fetched from what those Jews felt about Poland during the Second World War? Naturally, trying to picture today, at the 21st century, the way Jews saw, valued, or feared their neighbors during the war is a problematic issue. Testimonies given decades after the events might reflect the present today Polish image that naturally varies from the image held by Polish Jews more than 80 years ago. Fortunately enough, as Professor Engelking said, as Basha said, in many archives in Israel and abroad, one can find dozens of diaries and hundreds of documents, letters, written testimonies, and many other things, written testimonies from the war, written during the war by Jews. And in those essays, written mainly in Polish and Yiddish, but also in German and Hebrew, there are numerous references and statements regarding the Polish society that can enable us to identify the image held by Polish Jews even during the war. It should be emphasized that dealing with wartime image, one should use, I believe, sources composed and written throughout the events. And that's, in our case, of detecting the Polish image held by Polish Jews during the Holocaust, documents written under Nazi occupation. Today, I would like to focus mainly on the very first month of the war, and I must apologize for referring only briefly to the image nature in later years. I'm going back to my presentation. On the dawn of September 1st, 1939, Poland found itself in a desperate fight against a German invader. The Polish nation, Jews included, had mobilized itself to the battle. Jewish soldiers enlisted in their units, men and women from different social classes joined civil defense organizations, and many Jews took part in digging trenches and in preparing improvised aerial attack shelters. The upcoming war brought not only a will of sacrifice and a desire to help the poor and sick homeland, as Julius Feldman from Krakow wrote in his diary, but also created an important change in the relationship between Jews and Poles. In our township, wrote an anonymous Jew, it was as if the ONR, the Obóz Narodowo-Radykalny, and other anti-Semitic organization had never existed. Polish and Jewish youth are united in a common objective, marching hand in hand, and the anonymous Jew added, the sense of equality revives us, end of quotation. It would appear that with the winds of the war blowing, the Jewish public saw itself involved in a double campaign. One, against Hitler and the National Socialism, enemies of the Jewish people, and the second against Germany, the ancient enemy of the Polish people and the Polish state. In the eyes of the Jews of Poland, who had been exposed to accounts of German harassment of Jews since the rise of Nazi regime in Germany, the war presented itself as an opportunity to cash in on those who were spreading such poisonous propaganda about Jews and Judaism. Some even hope that the sure defeat of Nazi Germany, and they had no question that Germany will be defeated, will also defeat the radical winds within Poland itself. And I'm talking here about the Endecja and other things. Thus, the approaching war brought about an overlapping interest on the part of the Polish civilist interest and those of the general Jewish community in the struggle against Nazi Germany, being seen as a war against the enemies of Poland's Jews, both as Jews and as Poles. The Jewish public felt that the Polish society had undergone a fundamental change, and Jews believed that the future Poland, which would rise from the struggle, would modify its attitude towards its Jewish citizens, thanks to the certain defeat of the Nazi Germany and for the Jewish involvement in the struggle against Germany itself. Actually, for many Jews, the change was already apparent. In numerous writings from the war, Jews indicate the joint Polish-Jewish destiny, as well as a camaraderie between Jews and non-Jews during the defense war of September 1939. One example, out of many available, comes from a description of the Great Flight, the very first days of the war, and I will share my screen again. The very first days of the war, in which thousands of civilian Jews as well as non-Jews packed the roads, trying to hide from Nazi aerial attacks. Jewish sources expressed deep sorrow facing the horrible suffering of the Polish civilians, as well as Polish Jewish fraternity. For instance, this is how Jewish youngsters described the Great Flight in Hebrew of the Polish population in his diary, and I cite, and this is from Moreshet Archive. I have seen you, frightened and terrified, when destructiveness had brought death to you from above. I have heard the children crying in the thick forest, looking for their parents. I will remember your faces and eyes, which expressed only despair and fear. How can human being confront you in such times? And I, who shared my fate with you in those dreadful hours, as one of you, will remember you as you were, will remember you forever. End of quotation. Alongside the grief for suffering of the civilian population, and together with a brotherly feeling, the vast majority of Jewish writing expressed a great estimation to the open arms in which the Polish local population accepted the refugees, among them Jewish refugees. It should be admitted, wrote a refugee from Alexandrov, and it might be Daniel Fliegelman, we're not sure, in 1940, that whether those passing through were Jews or non-Jews, the locals demonstrated their absolute sympathy towards us and did what they could, and at sometimes even more than what they could, to lessen our difficulties. Complete strangers literally dragged us off to their homes, since it was not acceptable for them to allow Jews to be out in the streets in those days. End of quotation. Interesting enough, alongside this description, I'll stop here this again, alongside this description, there are actually almost no contemporary writings describing Polish attacks on Jews during the defense war of September 1939. Now here I must be accurate. There are a few comments regarding Jews being assaulted, literally or physically, but those acts are not attributed to the Poles. Those assaults are portrayed as done by margin part of the society or as a result of the war stress, and are not ascribed to the Polish society in general. In fact, this is a parallel process, which similar to it we'll meet later on. On the one hand, the attacks on Jews are ascribed to people or events who are alien to the Polish society, the margin part of the society, Volksdeutsche, or so on. On the other hand, assistance given to the Jews is ascribed to the general Polish public. In this way, the defense war of September 1939 created among Polish Jews a positive image of the Polish society. But describing the picture as a dichotomy is deceptive, and the situation was much more complicated. As an example, while is the general positive image created among the majority of the Jewish population in Poland in the beginning of the war, one can point out some noticeably subgroups within the Jewish society who saw Poles in a different manner. One example is the image it created in wartime accounts by Jewish soldiers who served in the Polish army. More than 100,000 Jewish soldiers enrolled to the Polish armed forces in the eve of the war, nearly all of them as enlisted men. In their writings, as in other Jewish writings from the days before the war, they expressed their strong desire to engage in battle against the Germans. Many of them even felt, as we said before, that they were about to fight their enemy as both Poles and Jews. But many Jewish soldiers faced hostility from the very first hours of mobilizations. Polish commanders discriminated against them while distributing combat equipment, as well as when posting them to military assignments. Some of them witnessed verbal or physical attacks on Jews, sometimes even on Jewish soldiers, and one soldier even wrote that the anti-Semitism in his unit was so strong that Jewish soldiers whispered to each other that even if the enemy bullets will have mercy on them, their brother in arms will kill them. Jewish soldiers faced potent anti-Semitic remarks and discriminating attitudes while enlisting during the fighting, as well as in the German captivity. And here I'll just say that there is a great differences from what we can see in those wartime accounts and in later testimonies that of course are available in different collections. And I'm returning here to those documents. Later testimonies depict a more complicated picture, which we won't refer to it here. In their war writing, the disappointment is very clear. In short, wrote Kopol Shaya Yeji from Pabnice, our boys, nashi chłopcy, behaved horribly in captivity and left an extremely bad memories. Here, and only here, I had the chance to see the true face of the Poles. Only here, I was able to discover the basic character, or should I say the lack of basic character of this little Polish nation. End of quotation. Hatred and contempt towards Poland and toward the Poles had taken the place of declaration of loyalty that has been so prevalent in the beginning of the war in those writing of the Jewish soldiers. The Polish image as appearing in the writing of the Jewish soldiers is shocking in its hostility, but also in its exception. And one should stress its unique manner. In parallel Jewish writing, written at the same times, an inverted image to the one created by the soldiers is reflected, a very positive image, which was mentioned before. For many reasons, many of them connected to the later fate of those Jewish POWs by Nazi Germany, the convicting contempt of the soldier image did not penetrate the conscience of the general Jewish public in Poland and did not damage the positive Polish image that was created during the defense war of September 1939. Moreover, in the following days and months, this positive image of Poland and of the Poles continued to take root and was even deepened. As well known, as soon as the fighting ceased, the Jewish population was subjected to restrictive and humiliating decrees, and Jews were also vulnerable to occasional abuses by German soldiers who used to grab Jews for forced labor while humiliating them in public. It is not my intention here, and this is very important to stress, it is not my intention here to examine how did the Polish population react to the persecution of the Jews in the beginning of the occupation. But I would like to ask, how did the Jews grasp the Polish reaction? In what manner did Polish Jewry describe in their own wartime writings the Polish involvement in Nazis' abuses, as partial as it was, or other aspects of inaction? In a diary, and I'm returning to my slides, in a diary written by an unknown young woman, it could be Helena Sirkus, we have a description of the first days of the occupation of Warsaw, when the city residence supply was open and the content distributed to the local citizens, and I cite, Two fat women with thick necks and broad chests are standing next to a pile of coal, gossiping to each other and flailing their arms about in a exaggerated gesture, energetically packing coal into a sack. They seem to be inhabitants of the Jolly Boots huts. Standing next to them is a Jewish woman of about the same age, thin and exhausted, filling a small straw basket with coal. For some obscure reason, the voice of the common woman, Baba, in the Polish source, it's called Baba, this woman is called Baba, is heard saying, and again, what is she doing here? Get away from here, to Palestine. I look up, the woman is getting excited and standing with her legs apart. She takes a huge piece of coal in one hand and aims it directly at the Jewish woman. The other woman is edging her on. The Jewish woman is alarmed, frightened, and with fear in her eyes, she tries to explain to this loudmouth that she accidentally touched her and she didn't mean to do it, but she is encouraged to leave the place. The common woman, with a piece of coal in her hand and anger of a person who had just achieved satisfaction, shouts, "For them, the good days are over, at long last. Their defenders have left already. Hitler will soon sort them out and put them in the rightful place." Her words hang like an echo in the sky above. Later on, this anonymous young woman described a Jew walking in Jelazna Street carrying a sack of salt, and I cite again, and as if from under the ground appears a well-built fellow, an Aryan with white soldiers, apparently an outcast of the society, Lupen Proletariat, and grabs the sack from the Jew, end of quotation. Constantly, the people who confronted Jews were portrayed by the youngster as Baba, loudmouth, the outcast of society, and thus as simple people. This phenomena of reducing the Polish negative involvement in Jewish harassment by attributing it to the fringes of the Polish society appears in most of Jewish documents written during the war. Immanuel Ringelblum, the well-known historian and the founder of Oyneg Shabbos Underground Archive, wrote in his diary, "Today, the 30th of January 1940, was a tough day for me. In the Saski Garden, a gang of Polish hooligans in the age of 14-15 noticed that I had an arm on my band. I barely managed to escape from them," end of quotation. In another place, he referred mainly to hooligans, unclear Christians, and hoodlum, huliganes, labuzes, and shkotzi. During Easter 1940, Poles attacked many Jews in Warsaw, usually as a result of German initiative and encouragement. Ringelblum underscored those actions in the following quotation. "Today, on the 23rd of March, young Poles, hooligans age 8 to 9, robbed our street. A truly horrifying sight. A gang of boys raced to rob Leshno Street, real street gang, MSA Gassenkinder," end of quotation. Ludwig Landau, the assimilated Jewish economist, wrote the following words regarding those same events, which were researched even by some of the scholars here. "A problem that is now increasing in Warsaw is the anti-Jewish incidents. Thus, the Jewish population lives in fear, and in the street of the Jewish corner, people are afraid to be seen in the streets. The hoodlums are mainly robbing stores, breaking into windows, destroying property, and above all, stealing goods. All of this is done by gangs, which are wandering throughout the entire city. Most of them young hooligans, and the rest scum of society. Bandim Lodów Listurków I różnych Szomowi," end of quotation. Similar things appear in Irena Gluck's diary, a young girl from Krakow, who in her diary found in Majdanek at the end of the war, and one can assume that this is where she found her death. She mentions, while walking the street, a Smarkula had mocked her. Ascribing the attacks to margin parts of the Polish society was only one strategy using to decrease the Polish responsibility for those acts. In the writing, some Jews emphasized the German initiative and the effective Nazi propaganda campaign. Thus wrote an anonymous Jew from Radom. From the very first moment the occupation began to implement its working plan to establish a false wall between Jews and Poles, end of quotation. Other avoided mentioning the aggressor by using a passive language. As a youngster from Lodz, Yarden, wrote in the diary, "It is hard to obtain food. Jews are being banished from all of the queues, taken to forced labor, and beaten cruelly. Who drove the Jews away? How were the Jews recognized at this point? Geves. This diary doesn't mention it." By emphasizing German responsibility and by reducing the Polish involvement, the Polish positive image was kept alive, and anti-Semitic acts were not acknowledged as representative of the Polish society at large. Corresponding to reducing the harassment appears a parallel phenomena, which was already visible in the defensive war of September 1939, referring to assistance given to the Jews at the onset of Nazi occupation as a Polish act. Now, the two terms I use to explain this phenomena are persuasive definition and comforting interpretation, terms that aim to indicate the mental gap between the events and the way they are described in contemporary writings. By using persuasive definition, a chosen definition itself that has a persuasive task, and comforting interpretation and comforting message rises from the interpretation given to the events, the writers reflect and shape their own understanding. Now, this is very important because today, many times, we're referring to the story of life people tell themselves about events that happened before. A few psychological research were done in Israel, for example, how Jews referred, or how people refer to events in where they were involved, for example, in a car accident. And giving a testimony right after the car accident itself, many times people say, well, I didn't know what happened. Suddenly the car just flipped over. Later on, those same people will describe the car accident in a different way, saying, well, I saw there is a problem. I hold on very tight, and this is how I managed to save my life. So we change our story during the time, and actually we're telling a story that then we can live with it. And what we can see in those wartime accounts is how those story of life already appear in those early Jewish documentation. And I will continue. Another example for this phenomena is in a short essay written by a young anonymous boy, which described an incident in which Banda Mlodych, a hooligan of Polski, a gang of young Polish hooligans, were beating Jews in the street. The boy managed to avoid those harassment with the help of a stranger who refused any thanks, saying that he just fulfilled his obligation. At that moment, wrote the boy, I thought to myself that even when extraordinary negative things are happening, they only reinforce the positive norm. End of quotation. The young man described those who tried to hurt the Jews as gang of hooligans, whether the man who came to his aid was seen as a man who expressed the heartful attitude of the average Pole. An interesting tendency that also informs those understandings is the fact that in many wartime accounts, Jews wrote about sympathizing reactions they got after the publication of the Jewish armband decree. Chaim Aaron Kaplan is an example, a man who can hardly be accused for loving people and writing about other people in a positive way, put moreover of Polish people, wrote on December 5th the following thing. At last, even Poles have begun to understand that the hatred of Jews which the conqueror spread among them is an opiate. We thought that the Jewish badge will provide the local population with a source of mockery and ridicule, but we were wrong. There is no attitude of disrespect. On the contrary, they show that they commiserate with us in our humiliation, and in private conversation, they even express words of condolence and encouragement. End of quotation. The Virchow Kowiak from Lodz also wrote about the fear from the Polish reaction to the marking of the Jews, and this is what he wrote in his diary on November 18th, 1939. A gloomy mood pervades in the city. The banded Jews are afraid of acts of harassment. The field is wide open for ridicule and oppression. I wonder how Poles will act. We'll see. But Kowiak's worries were proven false the next day, as he wrote in his diary. Poles cast down their eyes at the sight of the Jews with armband. Friends assure us that it won't be for long. End of quotation. So now, were there any negative reaction to the armband written in wartime accounts? Of course there were, but this is how they were described as an example by the famous Jewish poet Mordechai Gebertig in his poem Estutvei, It Hurts. It hurts terribly, not so much the hate that burns within the enemy, not even the beating from the hands of the savage foe, not the Star of David on our arms, a shame for many generations. A shame will be for them. And who are those them? Poland's sons and daughters, whose country in the future will be ashamed of them, laughing, choking with laughter, seeing this in the streets, how our common enemy has his sport with Jews. And they who laugh are happy and laugh at such a moment when Poland's pride and honor is being abased like that, when Poland's white eagle wallows on the ground amid the beards, black and gray hair from the Jewish beards. Isn't that a shame for them in all eternity? Isn't that by itself to spit into their own face? It hurts, terribly hurts. And actually what we can see here, and this appears in other accounts as well, that even when there are descriptions of Poles who harm the Jews, there is this assurance of the Jews that Poland is ashamed of those acts, and in future times, in future better times that will come for sure, those people will be seen as the most problematic part from the Polish point of view as well. And here I must say that one of the most important contributions to the strength of the Polish positive image was that many of them were ignoring the extensive inaction which characterized the reaction of many Poles to the persecution of the Jews. Now, I must admit that when I wrote the book, I used a different term. I used the term indifference. But today, thanks for the many different scholarship written mainly by Polish scholars, and I'm referring here to the group of the scholars in the center, and of course, Basha's writings and Darius Tola writings and many others, I'm much more hesitant in using the word indifference, and I'm using much more the word inaction, because indifference just give us the impression that people didn't do anything because they didn't care. But we don't know what was the reason for their inaction. So what we can see in those wartime accounts, the Jews hardly refer to the fact that many Poles just didn't do anything when those actions were done. And stressing the positive Polish acts and diminishing the involvement in Jewish attacks and ignoring the most prevalent Polish response to Jewish suffering, that inaction, were actually different strategies, but their outcome was one: the consolidation of a positive Polish image. And here we must ask, what can we, as a matter of fact, learn from this positive image of Poland and of the Poles, held by a large part of the Jewish population at the onset of the German occupation? Can we conclude that the Polish society helped Jews during the first month of the war? You know, this is what is written in their documents. Can we say that the Jewish perception represents the reality as it was? Unfortunately, I doubt it. Examining the positive image, which was described above, in the light of the reality as existed in Poland during the time, emphasized its delusional nature, which Basha already pointed out. Moreover, in later stages of the war, those very first months of occupation helped to create a different image of Poland and of the Poles. And here I mean a very different one, as the following sources will show. 1 second. In 1944, when Frederick Weinstein, a boy originally from Lodz, heard about the Allies landing in Normandy, he decided to write his memoirs. In them, he did not remember Poles casting down their eyes in the view of his armband, but Poles ensuring that Jews wore the Star of David. With regards to the Polish attacks on Jews, he wrote the following words. I'll refer to this writing in a second. There is no doubt that the initiator of those attacks and their propagandists were nationalist Poles and the Polish bourgeois. Both those groups wished to debase the Jews and kill them. Moreover, they used everything they had at their disposal in order to achieve those objectives. The Poles were so stupid and had no awareness to the extent that they believed in all the German anti-Semitic propaganda. Now, you can see in this writing that the initiator and the agitators of the propaganda, according to Weinstein, are not Germans, but Poles. Their goal was to kill Jews. And in his words, there is a great contempt to the Polish nations. And I'll return to it in a second, but just two remarks. First of all, you can see here his own handwriting, and you can see how in the beginning he wrote, and this is the first page when he refers to the landing of the Allies in Normandy and why he wants to write his memoirs, as well as the way he wrote those memoirs, wartime accounts, wartime memoirs later on. But what is interesting in this case is a very important document found by Elena Skabinska from the 3rd of May, 1942, in which a meeting is described, a meeting that is taking place in the Jewish synagogue, in which Jews and non-Jews are assembled in order to see how the Polish society can help the Jews. Now, what is so interesting in this meeting is that one of the members of this meeting is our friend Vini Kamin. Now, this is, and as I said, this was found by Elena Skabinska, and I thank her for that. But as you can see here, this meeting was not mentioned in his memoirs. It's not that later on he said that this meeting didn't happen. At the end of the war, and after his writing was published, the families that helped to assist him and was recognized as righteous among the nation, and which were described in his diaries, approached him. They approached him because in his writings, he referred to them as, although as being Poles, not acting as Poles, because all the Poles want to kill the Jews, and they did something different. And they said, we were not so different. And those Poles who helped him get those false identity also said, you know, there was this meeting in which this opportunity was opened. How couldn't you not refer to those things in your writings? And what Vini Kamin said is that, it's not that I don't say that those things happened, but when I was sitting in this loch in hiding, I didn't remember that. I didn't remember those things in such a way. This is how I saw the things in year 1944. I remember things differently. I described them differently. And here I want to say that such negative generalizations that we can find in his writing about Poland and of the Poles were absent in earlier Jewish writing, referring to the attacks as well to other aspects, because he is not alone in those accusations. Tadeusz Obremski heard in April 1944, while in hiding in the Aryan side of Warsaw, that Michael Klepfish, who was killed in the second day of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, was decorated with a Medal of Honor by the Polish government exile. And this is what he wrote. I'm now thinking deep inside, what is the purpose of this phrase? Why award Medal of Bravery to the dead people when they didn't want to help the living ones? I have been following the behavior of the Polish society from the beginning. Awarding this medal for bravery after the death arouses in me feelings of contempt. Now the Polish government has decided to make it so heard. Now, where there are no longer any Jews, where was the Polish government for 4.5 years of occupation? Why didn't it order as far as back at 1939 the Polish society to help the Jews hide from the German murderers? Why did they make it possible, and still do, to annihilate us here on the Aryan side? And Obremski answers, the Polish government kept silent at that time because the mass annihilation of the Jews was comfortable, as it's comfortable to all of the Polish society. It is here where the main crime of the government of the Polish people stems, the hostility to the Jews and the utter indifference, this is how he refers to it, of the Polish society. And Obremski concludes, all Polish society helped in destruction of the Jews, all of them, whether directly or indirectly. Most of our brethren fell victim on the Aryan side only because of the Poles. This will never be forgotten. End of quotation. And of course, Tadeusz Obremski, his wife Ala, and their daughter Junia did not survive the war. According to current estimation, they were murdered by the Poles who had hidden them until then. Even Emanuel Ringelblum, who had many contacts with the Polish society, referred to the Polish attacks on Jews not only in his diary that was cited before, and you can see it in front of you, but also in his later essay from 1944, from which I would like to cite now. The pogrom of February 1940, and this is what he writes at year 1944, was a profound shock to the Jewish population of Poland. The Warsaw Jews were deeply pained that no reaction against those acts came from the Polish society. No one is blaming the Polish nation for those riots and pogroms, and of course this is what he thinks, others say differently. We do, however, claim that there was no reservation, neither in writings nor verbally. We claim that no one rose up against those constant rampage, and no one did anything to weaken the impression that the Polish society in general stood behind those anti-Semitic Polish acts. End of quotation. One can notice easily that later Jewish writing illustrate a different picture than the one that was presented earlier. The assaults are attributed to the Poles. Assistance to the Jews, if mentioned, is restricted to minimal, and the Polish inaction is not only acknowledged, but also condemned, sometimes even harshly. A comparison of the positive description of Polish image appearing in the early Jewish writing to the wide-scale documentation we have from the later dates reveal few things. First, during the early months of the German occupation, the Jewish public, excluding some defined groups, held a positive image of the Polish society. This was true, I must emphasize, regardless of actual Polish deeds. And I will just say that according to my understanding, those first days and months of occupation are not researched enough yet, and maybe we can elaborate about it later on. At the same time, one should remember that in later stages of the war, this image changed dramatically, and here I gave only a peek to those later years. Thus, we should emphasize an important methodological issue. One cannot use Jewish wartime accounts as they are. It is not reality that was described in them, but reality as it was grasped by the Jews. In order to determine the extent of Polish assistance offered to the Jews, or the degree of Polish involvement in the persecution of Jews, one will need rather a wider factual base, including later Jewish writing, as well as Polish and German documentation. Returning to the positive image of Poland and of the Poles, which was created and preserved by extensive part of Polish Jewry for a long time, I believe it was based by many means on a distorted interpretation of the reality, an interpretation that allowed the Polish Jewry to develop and to maintain a hope for a better future for Jews in Poland. For the persecuted Jews, it was an imaginary evidence of their genuine and essential part in Poland in the present, as well as in better times that will come for sure. I also believe that this perception of Polish society indicates not only on the image of Poles as preserved by Jews, but also of the self-image of the Jews as Polish Jews. And thus maybe after all, Tuwim phrase, we Polish Jews, does express a view that was common to many Jews at the onset of Nazi occupation. Now, I didn't refer here to the many different changes that appear within this image in smaller places, in different geographical places, and even subgroups within the Jewish society. I will just say that there are not many texts which refer and focus on this Jewish perspective in an elaborated way. And if we would have had more time, but I want to leave time for a discussion, I will just refer to two very important documents, which I bring in my book very shortly, but you can, of course, read it in the Polish source. One is Meir Czarny letter, written on March 1942. And this is a letter he answers some kind of a professor or somebody who wrote to him from the Aryan side saying, well, you know, we haven't been in contact for a long time. I'm sure you haven't changed. And let's meet after the war, because this is an important time when we all learn very important things about different aspects of our life and beliefs and ideology. And Meir Charny answers him in a very, very long and painful letter, in which he's referring to what Basha mentioned before, this disappointment. And you actually can see in this document, as well as in the other one that I will mention, how he struggles between what he wants to think of the Polish society and what he sees. And he writes, for example, yesterday in the streets at the beginning of his letter, I accidentally ran to W, who handed me a letter from you. I admit that I have been waiting for it for a long time. Sometimes a recurring thought coming back that perhaps you too. I do not dare to complete the thought. It is too painful, but he's referring here to the thought that you too decided to keep away from the Jews and you don't want to have contact with us. I don't know whether we'll see each other again. I don't know whether I'll ever shake your hand, as well as a handful of those who have remained steadfast as and did not betray. And refers here in this letter, he gives heartbreaking description of the life in the ghetto and saying, you are saying that we don't change during the war. Of course I changed. I saw so many things. I feel that we need to have a true new set of words, because nothing can express what happened. And when the war will end, things will just be so different than they were. And he also says, I would like also to be able to rectify the falsehood and the lies that the enemy propaganda feeds you. Those are especially vile since they are often believed, because often certain facts are true despite this true being questionable. And the saddening thing about it is that many of you in the Aryan side believe that, evilness or stupidity. And in this literature, you can really see the struggle between those hopes and starting to understand that those hopes are delusional. Another important source in that aspect, and Meir Charny letter, is document 316 in Regelblum Archive Part 1. The other one, it might have been written by Wojcicki, and that is number 92 in Regelblum Archive. And this is segments referring directly to Polish-Jewish relationship. And it's important not only because he referred to good and bad aspects of those relationship, but he also refers to the Jewish understanding and the Jewish perspective as it is. And I'll just cite a few. And he says at the present time, however, the Polish people, more than any other, except the Jewish people, suffer the yoke of the German enslavement. And this is important because Jews were aware of the harsh German occupation in other later times as well. It should be shown above all compassion for the, those people, and thus it should have shown above all compassion for companions in misery and exhibit solidarity and fraternity with the Jewish people at every step. Unfortunately, this cannot be even dreamed about. And then he said that today, in the perspective of someone enclosing the ghetto of the wall, it's difficult to give a full measures of the eternity of the Polish-Jewish relationship and make generalization about this sad phenomena. However, the facts of everyday coexistence reveal at every step the painful and humiliating structure of those reactions, and that there is no arguing about that. And then he says, let's start with the positive aspects, and he's giving a list saying after that, but above all, those are only positive images that can be said about the subject of Polish-Jewish relations. Whether, unfortunately, the list of sins is much longer and fills with unforgivable sins, crying to heaven for revenge. And then he gives a very, very long list of things that he sees as a problematic attitude of Poles towards the Jews. But he ends with the following expert. One more thing, as far as the Polish-Jewish relations are concerned, we need to devote at least a few words to the attitude of Jews toward the Poles. And this is one of the only Jewish accounts which refer to it specifically. Firstly, it is important to determine that even in their suffering, the Jews remember with deep emotion and gratefulness, the act of the kindness toward them and the helping hand extended to them by each of those Poles. Surely we shall never forget them, and in the future we shall attempt to repay this favor. But despite this, the insult and humiliation, which will never be forgotten, no one wished to remember. They have faith in the Polish nation. And this is very important because actually when we look at those Polish sources, we can see what Basha said in the very beginning, this delusion of people having faith that the Polish society as a society is seeing them in solidarity. And actually here I want to try to conclude and to point out why do I think that this Jewish perspective is important when we're discussing Polish and Jewish relationship. Well, first of all, and this is a very important aspect of what I was trying to do, Jewish acts during the war were many times an outcome of their understanding, even if it was a mistaken understanding. The Jews, not only in Poland, in other places as well, didn't hear about Wannsee Conference and didn't know what the Germans decided at this point or at that other point. And their delusions and their hopes and their understandings were actually what determined their acts. And today we can even try to say, and this is a claim, so of course, that should be checked, that if we look on those later research written by the center, the latest notes and so on, one of the interesting things is to see how many Jews did try to flee and did try to seek assistance within the Polish society. And this Jewish perspective of Polish-Jewish relationship can explain why so many people thought that they can find assistance within the Polish society. This is one thing. Another thing, as I said, I could not refer to what happened in different geographical places and so on, and other aspects I'm referring to in the book itself. I would say that in eastern parts of Poland, in the Kresy, where there were other ethnical minorities, which were very much favorite of the Germans, this Polish positive image held by the Jews was made even stronger and even faster. The fact that there was some kind of another minority, not a Polish minority, that was seen as going with the Germans actually made it much easier for the Jews to see themselves in a solidarity with the Poles. Another thing that was already mentioned by Basha in the beginning is this methodical thing about feelings. Now, feelings and the research of feelings during the Holocaust, as well as in other historical areas or times, is very important. But I think that we should remember that feelings change all the time. And if we want to understand feelings and hopes and beliefs, we should go back to those wartime accounts, because in them we can see what people wrote in their wartime accounts, which many times is different from later documentation. For example, one subject that I checked in a different way, I know that other researched it as well, is dreams. How do Jews write in their diaries their dreams during the war? And how are those dreams depicted later on? And you can see that those are different dreams, not only in Poland, of Jews throughout all Europe, written in their diaries, daily diaries, and dreams later on as depicted in their testimonies. In their testimonies, and many times to say that they dreamt about food and about things like that, in their daily, and many times you can find people saying that I had this dream that my rabbi, my father, my friend appeared to me in the dream and said something, and this is what saved my life. You can hardly find those dreams in wartime accounts. You can find very difficult dreams, dreams of people that expose their guilt for their survival, sometimes partial survival, that as it's being reflected in dreams. So referring to emotion, referring to hopes, referring to delusions, those wartime accounts are very, very important. And the last thing that I want to say is that I think that this research might also explain what we many times hear from Holocaust Jewish survivors from Poland. People who are expressing a very negative image of Poland. This image many times derives from the later years and refers to their later understandings. And this is important because, as was said in the beginning, as high as the hope was deep, was the depth of the disappointment. And this is not something that changed. Something broke within the souls of those Jews, hoping and actually being sure that the Polish society sees things differently. And when they get in touch with that society, it could be in later years, it could be in camps, it could be after the war, and they understand that it was more delusion than actual acts. This is something that have a long shade that still emphasize our understanding. And I do hope that this research can help us refer to what happened in the Holocaust, not only in the German point of view and German orders, but really enable us to refer to the Jewish periodization and to Jewish understanding, something that is so much being done by your center, Basha and Agnieszka and Dagmara and Yaakov and all the others. And I do hope that in some way it refers to your studies as well. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Havi, for your fascinating presentation and, of course, for your research and your fascinating book. Just a reminder, we are now starting the Q&A session. If you want to ask a question or you have a comment, please write your name or the question in the chat window. Basha has a first comment, I see.
I have only one short remark about dreams, Havi. So-called visiting dreams. When you dream about a dead person visiting you in the dreams, you can find a lot of information in the diaries written during the war. And during the war, they are not writing it is the life-saving dreams, but they are writing about dead people visiting them. But the comment that this dream saved the life very often comes later, but the mention about dreams comes during the war in the diaries. Thank you.
Should I refer to it now or?
Yeah.
No. First of all, I mentioned the dreams because Basha as well has written about it, and this is a very interesting thing. So the only dream that I found for now that is really somebody saying, well, you know, I had this dream that something often will happen, and this is really some kind of almost somebody that sees the future, is Ben Shem, and we discussed it in the past. Reuven Ben Shem has in his diary a list of dreams. He says, you know, my wife always has those dreams that later come true. She had it in the First World War, and now she has all those dreams which tell us what will happen. For example, before the ghetto was established, she writes, she had this dream that all Jews were taken into the kishke of some kind of a chunt, and before the Great Deportation, or before, he says, before she had this dream that I was walking after this, I was walking under a tree with those red fruits, and they all fell on me and I became all red, and then I was walking in the street and I was caught by the German and beaten up. And then he said, I'm writing this because she had this frightening dream in which we need, both of us, she and I need to get to the train, which our daughter Yusima is on it. And we run to the train and we see the train leaving and we don't manage to get aboard on it. And of course, their daughter later on died. And he's writing that. So this is the only dream I found that predicts the future. Now, you are right, Basha, that many people mentioned somebody came to visit me. Now, the difference is, what did this visit mean? If we're looking at diaries, the dreams in the diaries, usually it's a very heavy meeting. What's her name from Lvov? In a second, I'll mention Basha's she says that she had this
About
visit.
her, yes, and dad, and
Yes.
grandpa.
Yeah, and
Yes.
they told her, you know, we seem alive, but there already a bullet was shot into our heart, and actually we're dead, and you're the only one who doesn't have this bullet, and you'll stay alive. Or this guy from Jewry, from Lithuania, said that he dreamt that in the great action in this small Lithuanian town of Jewry, he managed to escape with his nephew, and how he's hiding him and everything is okay. And of course he didn't succeed in helping him. And his mother, the grandmother of this child, is coming saying, oh, it's wonderful that you saved my grandson. And of course he didn't save anybody. So this is what you can find in diaries. In later on accounts, and that is in later testimonies, those visits become some kind of a positive, meaningful visit. At least this is what I found, and maybe you found something differently. For example, I almost froze, and suddenly my rabbi woke me up and told me that I need to daven, and this davening saved my life. Or I didn't know if I should jump the train or not, and I fell asleep, and my father woke me up and said I must jump, and I jumped, and this what saved my life. So there was a meeting in the dream, but what was its interpretation is very different. And those wartime dreams are so difficult and full with a feeling of shame and distress, which are not always apparent in those later dreams. So this is what
this is partly true. Not all dreams are difficult during the war. For example, there are dreams by Janusz Korczak about, traveling to other countries, meeting nice people, eating, and so on. But let us.
But also of coaching.
But let us stop for now. We need a separate seminar about dreams, I see, and let other people ask you a question.
Okay, Mr. Michał Grochowski has a question, I see.
Okay, first I wanted to thank you for the interesting lecture, but I have a question. How it's I've read some literature about the Polish Jewish relations about in 1930s and the progressively right-turning government and this systemic anti-Semitism. And I'm really surprised about this positive attitude of the Jews toward Poles in the aftermath of the campaign of 1939, that this short period where they found Poles compassionate, willing to work together and so on, was enough to kind of erase this longer period of the systemic conflict. So for me, it's not the later worsening of the attitude toward Poles is surprising part, because we know the reality of the occupied Poland, but this positive attitude in the first period. Do you have any idea how it comes that it was possible to attribute these negative parts of character only to the small groups of the hooligans or maybe some radicals, political radicals? Thank you.
Thank you, Michał. So this is a very important question, because first of all, it reminds us that we do not research the Holocaust in disconnection to other times. And it's very much connected to what happened in the 30s. And you are right that in the 30s, the relationship between Jews and non-Jews were very much complicated in a different manner. And we can mention the 1930, first of all, of course, Pilsudski death as a breaking point, and then 36 with its pogroms and other things as another breaking point. There is a beginning of the change towards 1938. When Poland is starting to get away from Nazi Germany, you can start to see a difference, but of course it's not as dramatically as we can see in those accounts. And my main answer will be that for the Jews, there was this very understandable and actually accurate difference between the German occupation and Poland. Poland is a different story. And since the occupation and its unequal harassment and different policy against Jews was so radical for many Jews, they saw it an opportunity for the Poles themselves to understand how dangerous are those radical winds that were flourishing in Poland in the mid of the 30s. For example, you can find in Jewry's accounts, which I didn't bring here, reference saying, well, you know, all that is happening to us now, and it will change very soon because for sure Germany will be defeated and Poland will rise again and everything will be okay. But what is happening now is the fault of the Endetia. It's because of them. And if they would not have evoked those things, Poland would not have fallen and so on. So for the Jews, it was an opportunity for creating an imaginary better Poland. And there was a great turning point when the war broke out. And actually one of the things, and I haven't gotten to it yet, that I think that many times we neglect as Holocaust scholars is that we talk about the Holocaust, we go right away to the ghettos and to the camps and to so on. For many, at least for many Jews, the most important breaking point in their daily life, economical status, whatever you think, as well as their understanding towards the surrounding, was really the occupation. Their life changed much more dramatically before the war to the beginning of the war than if we will check later on, the beginning of the war in the ghettos or anything like that. So this somehow explain it, but of course, you're right that we must see the things not as a separate topic, but connected to earlier times. And thank you for that, Michal.
Thank you very much, Professor Jan Woleński. To unmute yourself. Yeah.
Okay. So there is a methodological problem because we say Polish society and Jews. There are general names. However, for Polish society during the war, of course, and general government, in order to simplify, the issue was about, I guess, 10 millions of people or something like that. It is a mass population, statistical population. And a priori, so to speak, it would be difficult to expect something more than what you properly call non-action. So most of people, simply statistically speaking, is a regularity, wouldn't act positively or negatively for many reasons, but it doesn't matter. So people who help and people who did something against Jews were rather margins, however, quite important, because in this population it is about 10% on both sides. It was confirmed by calculation of Prekierova, who tried to elaborate the statistical model. The same, but even more complicated problem with is what are Jews, because very stratified group, religious, secular, but still Jewish by identification, assimilated, converted. According to German standards, there was no difference. Nuremberg law was simply biological. But attitudes, or I guess, of these different groups of Jews to Poles and reversely were quite different. I have my own experience, because probably I am in this company is only one person who lived during war, and I am a survivor in a sense because my family was Jewish. And but completely converted, even not only assimilated. My mother got a name in a synagogue, but she was baptized few months later. And I am sure that two Polish families helped us and perhaps even saved us in Warsaw. We didn't live in ghetto, but as Isaac Gutman told me, okay, you are very lucky because you could be discovered by Germans and your fate would be dramatic. However, I am very, very far from extrapolating my situation to say that Poles did. Simply, two families did. Even I don't know whether they knew my mother before, because my mother, we came to Warsaw in 1941. So I am not sure whether people who gave us living, I mean, we lived in their house, knew about my mother. Probably yes, because it was very difficult to hide this. So this is a problem, how to investigate these attitudes and the stratification of both groups. I am not surprised that Jews who were saved or Poles helped them have very good positive memories. I mean later, because memories from first days of war or months of war were of course expectations, hopes and so on. Other not. My relative, I met her in Jerusalem, who was in Auschwitz and survived. Her first word was, "Don't speak with me about war because I have bad memories." She was very happy that she could speak Polish with me. However, he completely denied any conversation about wartime. And what is interesting, and I suggest to undertake this research, attitude after war. For example, my mother never told me about war. I learned that I am Jewish quite lately, several years after her death. Also, people who helped us didn't tell me anything about this. They knew everything. So I lived after war several times in Warsaw, in this house in which we lived. It was completely science, even more. Tadeusz Seweryn, one of members of Żegota, was a close friend of my mother. And he was completely silent. I asked the friends of my mother after war, after when I learned about my origin, what do you know about the situation of my mother during war? And the closest friend told me, look, your mother opposed to have any conversation about this situation, and she said, you will not understand what was going on at that time. So it is really a very complicated methodological problem, because it is a temptation to extrapolate very interesting, of course, rememberings, diaries, and other documents, even you quoted. For me, it is quite fascinating to learn about, but I am against, as a philosopher, as a person who is involved in methodology of science, to extrapolate it. So I understand this word Polish society, but certainly I don't say fair or not fair, because it is not a problem of fairness. It's a problem of statistical regulation. That what is interesting, would be interesting, is comparison with other countries. For example, with France, where situation was, I guess, similar like in Poland, maybe not so dramatic, of course, there's another some. Anyway, thank you for your lecture, Havi.
Thank you very much for your comment, Professor Wolensky. I'll try to answer a little bit, refer to some things. So first of all, regarding Jews and Poles, you are of course 100% right that there were many kinds of Jews, and I'll mention 4 aspects of differentiation, which I refer to in my book, and of course couldn't refer here. First of all is changing according to time, and Jews change their understanding according to time. Second thing is big cities, smaller cities, and rural places. And there is also a different point of view in those places, which I could not refer, of course, here. Another change is according to those who were in the Generalgouvernement and those who were in the Kressi. I just mentioned it, the fact that there are other minorities. There were different Jews, as you said. And one other aspect is, of course, subgroups within the Jewish society. I mentioned here only the Jewish soldiers. Of course, the society was a little bit much more complicated. It's not only a question of religious and non-religious, and religious and non-religious is important regarding the Polish society, because for religious, there is this phrase in Hebrew, Esav sonel Yaakov, which means that, I don't know how you say the name of Esav in English, but the brother of Jacob is hating him from all generation. And this is a phrase that religious people used to say, well, non-Jews always hate Jews. So this was like a pre-understanding of some of the religious Jews, which of course had some kind of effect on their understanding during the war. I try to check it in the book, and I'll explain in a second why it's not so easy. I'll just say generally that the differences between religious and not religious is not as big as differences between Jews who are much more within the Polish society and those who are a little bit more far away. Jews who were very much close to the Polish society, many times their breaking point in the beginning, which was much stronger and earlier, and their breaking point later on, again, was later and different. But this is something I referred to in the book. Of course, I couldn't refer to all aspects here. I will say that the story of France is totally different. Not only because France, half of its citizens, Jewish citizens, were not citizens of France, but were refugees, and their whole story is different of the other ones. And not only because there was the occupied zone and the unoccupied zone, but French, for many Jews, and we can see it even for North African Jews, was a symbol for equality and liberalism. And one nice testimony, it's a later testimony, but it's still an important one for that, is of Albert Mamie saying that during the war, he saw Europe and modernity betraying him. Everything is collapsing. So the prior images of French Jews, citizens or not citizens, occupied zone, not occupied zone, is a totally different story. And if I would have had to compare something to Poland, I would not compare that. I might compare Hungary. That is a verse story. If Poland had larger borders during the period between the two world wars, Hungary found her borders much smaller, and then the question of who's Hungarian, what's Hungarian was very interesting. And even some aspects of Germans and seeing Germany is interesting. I'll just cite you a very interesting research by a colleague of mine, Guy Meron, who checked autobiography of Jews from Germany who emigrated to different places after the war. And those who emigrated to Israel referred to anti-Semitism as much more apparent than those who emigrated to other places. And that is in autobiography written afterwards. So it's not the same thing, but you're right that we cannot talk about the Jews. I'll also say that it's right that we cannot talk about the Poles. And in the book, I'm trying to refer to the way Jews also referred to subgroups of the Poles. You mentioned Perkerova, rural people, intelligentsia, the Polish police, and many other things. It's much more complicated, but we had only about an hour and not more than that. A second thing that you are saying, and I won't refer here, is all the question of indifference and inaction. This is something that I started to think after a conversation. I don't know if you remember that, dear Darius Stola, years ago, talking about the problematic usage of indifference. And in the latest research written by the center, and again, I'm mentioning Basha, but not only, also Agnieszka and Dagmara and Carolina and many others of this group, you had actually demonstrated to us that the fact that people did not act didn't mean that they had the same motive. It could be that they didn't act because of terror, because of anti-Semitism, because of greed, because of many other things. And I just mentioned that to be aware that today we have to be very, very careful for using this term of indifference, as Derek, you said years ago. So this was only that, and we can have a whole discussion about that aspect. Regarding after the war, again, this is a very important and interesting topic. Natalia Lekshun referred to it, and she's here. Chilik Weizmann, an Israeli young scholar, wrote a very, very interesting PhD about that, as well as others. But of course, Professor Volensky, you're right, and there are many, many other things that we still need to research and learn better. So thank you for your comment.
Thank you very much. We've got a question from our Facebook page from Adam Puławski. Professor Dreifuss, on the other hand, what is your opinion about reaction of Polish government in exile toward Jewish during war, especially during Action Reinhardt time?
Okay, so you have great scholars who refer to that, and you know their names. We already mentioned Stola and Engel and others, and we have the latest research written by Derek Limbionka and others. So what I checked was, how did Jews in occupied Poland see what the Polish government exile did or didn't do? And their reference are mainly very, very critical, and mainly on the after this breaking point. Prior to that, and this is something we haven't mentioned here at all, but it's very, very important, there are many references to the Polish government exile in the underground newspaper published in Warsaw Ghetto. In it, there you can see actually again the struggle of trying to understand how Poland, which we still think is something that will raise very soon, and we the Jews will have an important part in it, and so on. How come Sikorski say this thing or that thing, and so on? Regarding your question about the actual act of the Polish government exile, here I will base myself on what my colleagues and friends wrote. And they showed how the information was available, and the way that the Polish government exile used this information in order to promote other aims that it had from the political point of view. So this will be quite a short answer for a very, very important question. And again, here I refer to the image of the Poles in occupied Poland. What I don't know, and I'm sure there is some research written about it, I haven't read it, I'm just thinking about it now, thanks for your question, thank you, Adam, is what was the image, and I'm sure it was a complicated image, of the Polish government exile for non-Jewish Poles, for Poles in occupied Poland, regarding their actions of the Polish government exile. I know that there is, of course, a criticism, and we all know Jankowski report and so on, and so on. And I think you referred to that, but I need to go back to those writings of yours as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Professor Dariusz Stola has a question.
Thank you very much, Havi, for the presentation. I'm really looking forward to reading your book, and I hope it will be published in Polish too. I have a comment and I have a question. The comment first about this very positive comments from the early weeks of war. I remember, when working on Ignacy Schwarzbart, and his hope, a very strong conviction that the war is actually an opportunity to re-establish equality of Polish Jews, to bring kind of a brotherhood. I think he was using the term brotherhood. And my understanding was that the German invasion against Poland was actually the German threat against Poland before September 1st, 1939, in 1939, was actually a hopeful moment for the Jews because it was ending the isolation. Jews didn't have any allies against Hitler before that moment, especially with Munich. The only powerful anti-Nazi force was the Soviet Union, and not everybody loved the Soviet Union in late 1930s. So then the war against Poland and the fact that Great Britain and France was beginning the war against Germany was actually a hopeful moment. Jews were no longer alone in the face of the Nazi threat. Well, so Schwarzbart, he left Poland on September 17 to Romania, so he could have remembered these early moments of war. And then in London in isolation, he continued, but he was not alone. And I would even say that that was not a delusion, because we know that in case of a trench war, industrial wars like the First World War, when you have masses of people, of men in trenches, this is a very egalitarian experience leading to democratization. In most of Europe after the First World War, in the United States after the Second World War. So if the nature of war could have really influenced things in a very different direction than it did. So this is a comment about it. And I always wondered why you find terms like treason and betrayal in Jewish memoirs of the Polish behavior during the war. How, for me, it was a sign that those people actually, they still believe that there is something uniting Poles and Jews, because only one of your own can betray you. An enemy cannot betray you. So I wonder to what extent that was also a consequence of these high hopes of 1939, before September 1st and in the first weeks of the occupation. And now a major point, which is what you said about the changing interpretation of dreams. I understand that when you have accounts, you can distinguish between description of specific events, something very behavioral, and generalized opinions. And these opinions can change, especially during and after a period of high emotional intensity. And for most of Europeans, Second World War was full of very strong emotions, and for the Jews in particular, all kinds of emotions. And what you have said, especially the fact that this man from Gniewczyna, the Weisenstein, right? He did not remember the meeting in Gniewczyna. It makes it a step further. So emotions were not only changing his generalized opinion, but the fact that he didn't remember certain events and remembered well some other events. And this is actually a major challenge for historians relying on personal accounts. I remember I didn't like very much Jan Tomasz Gross' so-called affirmative attitudes towards the accounts of the survivors. Why? Because I believe that this is a way to dehumanize the survivors. They were human beings. They have the right to say wrong things, to make errors, not to remember, or to actually invent stories for this reason or another. So my question is, do you think a way to develop a methodology of dealing with this problem? For example, if you could compare Jewish accounts from various countries and very different political conditions in Europe, can you find a pattern in it? And my final question is about the early post-war accounts. You have this hundreds of accounts collected by the Jewish historical commissions in Poland. You know, a basic source for the Polish Jewish history. But they were written in a very specific moment. How this specific moment could have affected these accounts, and could we find a tendency, for example, that the probability of some opinions will be bigger because of the time of recording these accounts? Thank you.
Thank you, Derek, and thank you. First of all, I agree completely with the first two comments, because I really think that for many Jews, this war was their war not only because of fighting the Nazi Germany, who had harassed Jews in Germany, and they were aware of what happened in Germany, and not only for the country that now attacked their homeland, but also they really believed that this will undermine the racial winds that started to rise in Poland from the mid-30s. Now Poland will understand how wrong those views are, and it's a question of time that the war will be defeated. And of course, Germany will just have to pay the price. They have no doubt about it. And you are right that you mentioned the fact that Great Britain and France also declared war. This is not a question. They were so much focused on this imaginary future Poland that this also strengthened this brotherhood that you said. Now, Schwarzbelt really left earlier, but I think that his understandings really also reflect those very first days. Now, later on, well, I'll say it in a moment in a different way. We like to, people, as human beings, we like to depict events in order that they reassure our thoughts that ensure us of some kind of a future. So this positive image is going on and getting bigger and stronger, even when Jews and non-Jews are not really meeting each other. And there are some points that they don't really meet each other. So I definitely agree. And what you said about betrayal is also very important, because this is a feeling of betrayal. You can hear Abramsky. He is really offended for the way that he was betrayed, and he's not the only one. And this again is another example for how those Jews build this. And it is an imaginary image, but it was very powerful for many of them. And when it was shattered, it's not there. They're saying, oh, well, so things are different. It's a breaking point. And this had its impact for many different things. Now, regarding what you said about dreams, I am not a psychological like Basha, but my first degree was in history and psychology. And I do remember that today it's not even a question, that we remember things according to our state of mind. So when I'm in a gloomy mood, I remember all my failures. And when I'm in a good mood, I remember all my success. And there are even those who did those psychological experiments of learning underwater and taking the test underwater while learning in a different way. And this is why we recommend our children to study for their tests sitting near a stable and not on the floor or whatever. I don't know, this is at least how Israeli students study for their tests. This is part of it. We recall easier, we call things easier to those that we are in that state of mind. And this, of course, has an impact on later accounts. Now, its impact on later accounts, I will say, is even more complicated, because those very early testimonies, which were gathered, many times were gathered for a specific reason, to give testimony for a specific event, that German or that thing. It's not like we can take testimonies in the latest years when somebody is telling his whole story, and then we know from where he is and when what school he went and what were the beliefs of his families. Those very early testimonies are very, very short, and many times are under the impression. And it could be the impression of the horrible devastation of the Polish Jewry. It could be under the impression of those noble Poles who saved my life, or of other things. So I don't know if I have a methodological general understanding about that, but I think it just strengthened our challenge as historians to read documentation, including those testimonies later or earlier, wartime accounts and visual documentation and on, in a very, very careful way. And it's really, we don't have many examples of people as Ringelblum. We can say that he described it at 1939, and then in 1944, he recalls what happened and look how different it is. We don't have so many examples of Friedrich von Kamin, but we do have a very different narrative from the beginning of the year, at the beginning of the war later on. And this, of course, emphasizes this methodological challenge that you mentioned. So I don't have any thumb rules that I can say, but I think it does stress how careful we as historians must be.
Thank you very, very much. That was the last question. So thank you everybody for your time. Thank you, Havi, for once again. It was a very big pleasure to host you on our seminar. And well, have a fantastic summer. And we invite you to other seminars of the center in the autumn. So thank you once again.
Thank you, Agnieszka. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Havi. Thank you for your time and for a wonderful lecture, and hope to read this book and next one in Polish very soon.
Thank you very, very much. Thanks.
So thank you, and see you in the autumn, everybody. Goodbye.
Goodbye.